anything. Let's call this mystery gal in the bed Jean Doe. All in favor?
When people think of Marvel's greatest shapeshifters, the first name that comes to mind is Mystique. And while that is definitely valid, my personal favorite is Morph. He might not be as iconic or popular, but he is the strangest of them all. Not to compare, since both shapeshifters serve different purposes, but I love how Morph's anatomy at base form is just that of 8 pounds of white goo. He is not like Principal Weems from Wednesday, who is a tall blonde woman at base but can transform into anyone. No, he is just a blob who can become anything. Of course, there are limitations, but it does not take away from how bizarre he is. Out of all shapeshifters in Western comics, Morph's anatomy intrigues me the most, which is why I come to you with this video with the intention of breaking down how things work for Morph, what he can do with his abilities, what he cannot do, and so on. So let's jump right in and talk about Marvel's super unconventional mutant. Morph's metamorphosis, a Play-Doh-like mutant. Morph's base form is not that of a regular human. Instead, he is 8 pounds of chalky white goo with physical consistency like that of Mercury. And today I will explore the version of Morph we meet as part of the multiversal team known as the Exile, which the shapeshifter joins after being plucked out of time, prior to which he had been an Avenger, a regular X-Man instead of a multiversal exile, and the leader of the New Mutants. Using his psionic abilities, courtesy of being a mutant, Morph can alter his biological cells at will and restructure them to imitate someone or something else. Technically, if I shapeshift into you, I will also end up with your voice, because my vocal cords, windpipe, mouth anatomy, skull, lungs, and so on will morph into the same ones as yours, allowing me to generate the same sounds as you. This would also mean that if Morph turned into me, he would get my bad case of myopia. That aside, he could also assume any semi-humanoid or humanoid form and acquire the necessary clothing on his body as well, with the clothes operating as part of his anatomy. And to make it all possible, he developed a photographic memory soon after discovering his fascinating set of powers. However, he could not duplicate the fingerprints of others. His very high-end shapeshifting is made possible by his biology being that of a bunch of very unstable molecules, which he would psionically arrange at will in a fraction of a second. He does not necessarily have to take a stable form. He can become essentially anything, much like Play-Doh. You can take a lump of clay and form snakes out of it, turn it into something more complex and tangible, or just give it a random shape by pulling and pressing it. Morph's biology works the same way. He can expand himself, flatten himself, take a human form but assume a giraffe-like long neck, compress his torso and make it look unnatural, stretch out his body to mimic a parachute, and so on. Even if he turns into a non-human thing or even a substance, let's assume a box, he can retain his consciousness. Coming back to the clay analogy, amputations also cannot work on him, because if a part of him gets severed, he can attach it to himself since his basal anatomy is goo. Of course, he would need some time to recover later. Morph's physiology as a blob also means he can survive weeks without water and food. His cellular structure helps him regenerate at remarkable rates. He is safe from drugs, poisons, and earthly diseases. He also does not get fatigue. Now coming to his clothes, which I previously mentioned as something that is part and parcel of his anatomy. So if he were to wear external clothes, that would be one thing. He would morph only his body while the clothes would not change. But his clothes are like his inherent biological costume and part of his body. When we are introduced to him in the comics or the animated series, we see him in his neutral form. Chalk white skin, completely white eyes, no nose, and a smile. That's Morph's face. He looks a bit like Voldemort, but with even less facial definition. At least Voldemort had nostrils. He looks humanoid, but not human. He does not even generate hair, but his odd appearance is treated very normally. Unlike his parents who wanted him to look like a regular boy, the X-Men do not seem to care and treat his appearance very casually. Where do Morph's powers come from and how did he begin to control them? While mutants generally begin to manifest and control their powers at puberty, Morph, or Kevin Sidney, knew how to work around his odd anatomy since he was a toddler. Part of it was due to his parents being particularly happier if he assumed the form of a human boy. So he would stick to his shape-shifted form of a regular all-American boy, which obviously made his school life easier as well. It's not like showing up to school in an odd uniform or as a lump of goo would make him very popular. but in America you cannot go wrong with the form of a guy who is gifted when it comes to sports. Because he can completely change everything about his body. He can attain higher or leaner musculature, the appropriate height, and so on, and get a boost in his strength, speed, and durability. And that obviously helps not just in sports, but also in battles. If I were to physically turn into the Hulk, irrespective of whether I can throw a punch or not, whatever I throw would cause enormous damage even if my technique was off. We do not really get much of his origins in the X-Men 97 animated series, so the on-screen information is highly limited, which means we must go by comics mostly. But after discovering his powers and leading a normal life as an American schoolgoer, he eventually meets an obstacle that causes a change of plans, as his mother passes away due to lung cancer when he is only 13. Spousal deaths are some of the hardest, most debilitating things to ever experience, so it is no surprise his father begins to view life differently. One thing leads to another, and he ends up sending Kevin to Xavier's Institute for Higher Learning, where Kevin finally acquires his iconic codename of Morph and joins the New Mutants. He leads the team, gets a master's degree in engineering and computer science, graduates to become an X-Man, joins the Avengers alongside Beast to represent mutants, and then returns to the X-Men as he feels like they were his family, more so than the Avengers. Either way, there is no story of Kevin Sidney becoming a shapeshifter out of the blue like his Marvel peers such as Spider-Man and Captain America, with Peter Parker acquiring his powers after being accidentally bitten by a radioactive spider, or Steve Rogers acquiring superhuman stats after being injected with the super serum. Morph was just simply built different. Since birth, unlocked his powers very quickly, and began to control them in order to perform normalcy for his parents. How did a forgettable one-shot villain from 1967 become one of the most beloved X-Men? Kevin Sidney predates Morph, and the lore for this goes back to the late 1960s when writer Roy Thomas and artist Werner Roth created a character called Changeling for the X-Men, and his true name was Kevin Sidney. He was the prototype. He was a mutant shapeshifter who was originally an adversary, albeit not a very prominent one for the X-Men. He had impersonated Professor X and died shortly after. His run started with the Factor 3 storyline, with Factor 3 being a group of villains. With him dying shortly after morphing into Professor X, Changeling was the first X-Man to die in action, and that was the temporary end of the character. But we cannot get to why he was loosely revived without talking about Thunderbird. So in the 90s, the writers and producers wanted to raise the stakes for the X-Men by killing off an important character, and Thunderbird was murked as a result in an early mission. But the problem lay in Thunderbird having been a Native American character, killing off not only one of the few superheroes of color, that too a Native American one, would have been quite the scandal even back in the 90s, more so because Thunderbird's introduction and death did not have a big gap. They did not want to kill a long-term established mutant either, since that would be too risky. So new decisions had to be made as Marvel needed the ideal lamb to slaughter. Creators began to look through older issues to replace Thunderbird, and stumbled across the long-forgotten Changeling. His identity was then rebranded as his original name as Kevin Sidney was retained, but his mutant name was switched to Morph, more so because DC Comics had a more popular Teen Titans hero known as Changeling. And Marvel and DC getting such an obvious overlap would be a controversy, since DC's Changeling was much more popular. And if you cannot put the pin on who this guy is, his name was eventually changed to Beast Boy, so Marvel changed the name for nothing. But then again, Changeling was not the best name for kids due to it being a mouthful. Morph was perfect. Some of his lore was changed since the original Changeling was a second in command in Factor 3, and served a second-rate Magneto known as the Mutant Master, who wanted to promote and establish the supremacy of mutants over the planet. But the Mutant Master was later proven to be an alien who wanted to destroy mutants as well as humans alike, causing Changeling to switch sides and turn on his master, following which he joined hands with the X-Men and died soon after in the line of duty. This also made him the first X-Man to ever die in action. This happened due to Changeling contracting a terminal disease and seeking the assistance of Professor X, who had to concentrate all of his energy on the shapeshifter, dying in the process. By this time, Changeling had atoned for his crimes. With Professor X gone, someone had to fill the vacuum, so Changeling stepped up. Too bad he ended up dying soon after, thanks to the villain known as Grotesque. After the rebrand into Morph, this former origin story of Changeling was scrapped. But the Morph guy grew popular with the kids, and his new appearance was solidified in the 1995 Age of Apocalypse event, which was an alternate universe version. This is where Morph debuted with his chalky white skin, bald head, and a half-drawn Voldemort-like face. This eventually led to his introduction as one of the primary characters as part of the reality-hopping X-Men known as the Exiles. Much like the original, this version of Kevin Sidney hit the hay as well. But 2019 was kinder to him with the X-Men in the modern Krakoan era, as the X-Men unitedly live on the island sanctuary known as Krakoa. Krakoan methods of resurrection and Charles Xavier's psychic backups in Cerebro led to Kevin Sidney coming back to life. He has a more comic relief-like role in the animated series instead of being one of the main guys, although he is important, but he wants to become a main member of the X-Men again. What actually happens to Morph's body when the team leaves him for dead? The worst nightmare of the X-Men would be the Sentinels, as these robots are policed and designed to fight or capture mutants. They were created by Master Mold, another robot much more enormous than the Sentinels themselves. And as luck would have it for the perpetually dying Morph, the first encounter between the X-Men and the Sentinels led to his elimination during the X-Men's raid on the mutant-controlled agency headquarters. For starters, this was a huge moment for a kids' show, as a beloved character was killed off. Too bad for them, Morph was literally created to be killed off, and his death was not clean either. He essentially sacrificed himself as he took the fire meant for Wolverine and moved him out of the way, getting shot down himself in the process. Because the X-Men were overwhelmed, Cyclops ended up making the difficult decision to leave Morph's body behind and retreat. From his point of view as a leader, it was more important to save the rest of the X-Men instead of endangering more of his comrades. For Wolverine, this was unacceptable as Morph died trying to save him. While the entire ordeal was hard and devastating on the entire team, the ensuing clash over the retreat between Wolverine and Cyclops drove a powerful wedge between the two. While they believed Morph was gone for good, Mr. Sinister had found the shapeshifter's body and he had his own sinister plans with it. Who is the other Morph that Sinister builds out of the same body? Mr. Sinister nursed him back to health. Needless to say, this did not come without repercussions, as Mr. Sinister implanted a device into him to control him. This gave rise to a new version of Morph, a much more vengeful one. And this darker version of the shapeshifter was geared to seek vengeance against his former teammates, or the X-Men who had left him behind. He went on to fight the X-Men, but was eventually knocked back into his senses and ended up helping the X-Men escape the clutches of Mr. Sinister. But he fled instead of joining them and retreated deep into the jungle in order to fight off Mr. Sinister's brainwashing over his mind. While Cyclops left him the last time, and that eventually became the reason for the wedge between the leader of the X-Men and Wolverine this time, Wolverine returned for Morph to bring him back. But instead, he fought Morph and was overwhelmed, following which Morph fled due to his personal issues. Morph then worked in a circus sideshow for a living, but was eventually found by Sinister, who regained his control over him and forced him to contact the X-Men. Sinister's plan was to lure in the X-Men using Morph without revealing his new personality to them. This would be followed by this new persona then sabotaging the X-Men from within. Morph posed as a priest and performed a fake wedding for Jean and Cyclops, and lured the two into a deserted island. All of this was done due to Sinister's desire to capture them. While Jean and Cyclops expected a nice honeymoon, they were ambushed by Sinister and the Nasty Boys, and ultimately Jean Grey was taken. Morph caused other troubles, such as inciting Gambit to kill Rogue, and even lured Magneto and Professor X to Antarctica. However, in the Savage Land, Morph was stripped of his power and forced to defend himself. Throughout everything, it was revealed that vengeful Morph was not so much a brainwashed Morph, but more so a different persona coexisting in the same body as the original Morph. Some fans have associated it with a dissociative personality disorder, but this has never been confirmed in the animated series or the comics. In fact, the disorder is generally organic, so I would not correlate it with a condition caused using an implanted device. But the Savage Land managed to bring him back to his original condition to a great extent. But his struggles were far from over, as he was soon chained alongside Jean, Magneto, and Professor Xavier. Whatever of his conditioning remained was undone during this time, courtesy of Professor X. The device implanted in his head by Sinister was removed, and this helped Morph finally return with the X-Men. Following this, Morph got his treatment in Muir Island and was occasionally visited by his X-Men friends. After getting completely clean and healthy, he officially rejoined the X-Men, but this did not solve everything, as ensuing missions involving the Sentinels triggered his PTSD and paralyzed him with fear. But this also laid the foundation for Morph ultimately destroying Master Mold, the creator of the Sentinels, as he was desperate to prove himself, which required him to overcome his fear. He also helped rescue Professor X, but he still was struggling mentally, which led to him leaving the X-Men once more to heal, with the promise of returning once he was psychologically ready to resume his life as a hero. When Morph turns into another Marvel hero, how much of that transformation is real? Morph can attain the physical state of another person, although maintaining it is where the struggle is at. In this form, he can possess the physical attributes of whoever he has morphed into, but he cannot acquire their psionic powers, since that is not physical. That is a mutation, and it is part and parcel of being a mutant. Hypothetically, even as Captain America, he can acquire strength from his muscle mass and greater durability, but only relative to a human. The super serum is a different component, and Morph cannot acquire that power because he cannot replicate the effects of the super serum. He can only be jacked and get the subsequent strength and durability of the jacked physique. This was a necessary limitation added by the creators to prevent him from being way too overpowered, which would rightfully affect the story. Director and producer Jake Castorena spoke about this in his book X-Men 97, The Art and Making of the Animated Series. He said, and I quote, "The definitive rule we came up with is that Morph can adhere to any physical attributes of anyone that they morph into. For example, if Morph turns into Colossus or Juggernaut or Psylocke from the muscle memory of said character, Morph has to concentrate and regenerate those cells all the time for that. So for the metal skin, if they're doing Colossus, that comes at a cost. But what Morph cannot do is mimic any sort of mutant power ability, like laser fire, anything like that. That isn't the physical attribute of the character. Point being, Morph cannot have access to Cyclops' optic blasts, or anyone's telepathy or telekinesis, and so on, because these traits, as mentioned, are psionic, not physical. But he can get abilities like flight if it comes from physical attributes, and we see him doing it in the pilot episode of the animated series, when the plane of the X-Men is attacked by the Sentinels, and the X-Men begin to freefall. Morph cannot fly himself, so he turns into Archangel, and gets access to flight via that anatomy as it comes with wings, following which he flies alongside Storm and Rogue to save the others, while Cyclops uses his blasts to slow his descent. What can't Morph become no matter how badly he wants to? As per the Exiles comics continuity, Morph can transform into things like Captain America's shield or even Thor's hammer, as he can morph into absolutely anything. But he cannot gain their properties, much like he cannot mimic psionic abilities. This is because he only changes his form. He cannot alter that form into vibranium or become Mjolnir, which is literally a godly weapon from Norse mythology. Instead, he can pull off tasks like temporarily discarding molecules from his body when he has to morph into something which has far less mass than his biomatter. If he has to transform into something much bigger, denser, or heavier, he can draw in additional molecules from what is assumed to be an extra-dimensional source. But it is once again temporary. He cannot maintain these forms like his base semi-Voldemort-faced appearance. Other tricks up his sleeve are absorbing attacks by morphing his body. For example, he has been shown deforming his body in the face of man-made ballistic projectiles, causing his shape to mess with the trajectory of the projectile on impact. Or he can morph his form in such a way that the projectiles will pass through him without harming him. This also protects him from attacks such as stabbing or anything that cuts, as he cannot be cut. Basically, he is a swordsman's worst nightmare. Through everything, we must keep in mind that these are not set in stone. What does shape-shifting have to do with Morph discovering a non-binary gender identity? As established, Morph is a blob. Assigning gender to 8 pounds of goo is odd if you think about it. I mean, Morph's parents did name him Kevin, so we initially see him as a male for the most part. But Morph can assume any form. He just assumes the form of a man for his parents. Otherwise, his identity can go either way. Naturally, the creators of the character and the crew of X-Men 97 envisioned Morph as someone who would discover their gender identity to be of a non-binary character, and it would be a core aspect of their arc. However, the crew did not wish to announce it on screen due to the comics being released in the 90s. Back then, neither was the term non-binary something the masses were aware of, nor would it fly as easily as it would today. For that reason, Morph is consistently made to use he and him pronouns, although Rogue does refer to Morph as a they at times. This identity goes perfectly with Morph being a shapeshifter, and I guess most fans agree with this, myself included. But there has been critique as well, with a Gizmodo writer pointing out how the only visibly inhuman or mutated-looking character was made queer, and I can see how that can be a problem. On the other hand, producer Castorena has added his own tidbits, not directed towards the Gizmodo writer, but his claims explain why the non-binary identity is appropriate for Morph. Basically, Castorena has claimed that Morph's altered physical appearance represents their attempt to move past trauma, and ultimately, the shapeshifter's core identity is of having multiple identities, which means Morph cannot have a traditional gender like a man or a woman. They can be anything. Non-binary is just the simpler word for it. The most fascinating characters are not always the strongest or the fastest. Sometimes it is the weird ones that really do it for you. Not just because they are written very creatively, especially when it comes to their abilities, but because of how a good writer can blend oddity with sentimentality. And when you take a bizarre character meant for comic relief and add layers to their personality, allowing us to see their grief, witness them overcome loss, or rediscover themselves, the character becomes unforgettable. And with that, we wrap up this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Do share your opinions with us in the comments, and of course, like and subscribe. And have a great day.